So welcome to Inside Covering the War in Ukraine. This is a virtual event featuring NPR correspondent Brian Mann. And this conversation is part of St. Louis Public Radio's participation in the American Homefront Project. That is a major media initiative that reports on the lives of military personnel, veterans, and their families. And major support for the American Homefront Project comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting as part of CPP's ongoing effort to expand coverage of local, regional, and national issues. I'm Milam with St. Louis Public Radio, and it's been more than 9 months since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, and NPR correspondent Brian Mann went to Ukraine as part of the team who covered the war for the network. He waited in a bomb shelter in Odessa as the people there tried to flee the city and was on the front line during shelling that was going on in Mykolaiv. And he also brought stories of children in the war zone to the world. So more about our guest this evening. Brian Mann is an NPR addiction correspondent. He covers the opioid crisis and U.S. drug policy, and he also works as part of NPR's team working in hostile environments, and he reports on natural disasters, mass shootings, protests, and other events. And when he's not traveling on assignment, Brian lives in New York's Adirondack Mountains, where he's an avid climber as well as a backcountry skier. Brian Mann, welcome, and thank you very much, Brian, for joining us tonight on this conversation.
Oh, it's great to be here, Rod. Thank you so much for including me in this American Homefront Project. It's great to be here.
Well, from the background that I read with you and our little pre-Zoom conversation that we had, this was your first time actually going into a war zone and being a war correspondent, although you have a long journalistic career. When did you get the idea that you wanted to cover what was going on in Central Europe?
So what happened, Rod, is that I was working for NPR in Beijing earlier this year for the Winter Olympics. And people may remember that Russia became a major story during those Olympics. There was a scandal involving a Russian figure skater, but also Vladimir Putin came, and he was there with Xi Jinping. These two authoritarian leaders were there, and it was at a time when there were these rumblings of the war, that there were troops already massing on the Ukrainian border. In the Olympic Village where I was living, it was, that was all people were talking about, was this conflict that was brewing. And so I started researching and learning about it. And when I got home, and it became clear that the war was going to go on for a while, that the Ukrainians were going to hold back the Russian offensive, I volunteered to be, part of the team that rotates into Ukraine. And after some weeks of the war, when the first line of NPR journalists needed to be relieved, needed to take a break back from the front lines, they rotated out, and I was one of the journalists who rotated in. So it was really that series of connections that drew me to this. And I, as you mentioned, I had training working in hostile environments. So, I knew how to wear body armor. I had been trained by NPR's teams how to be aware of risky situations. And so, that allowed me to go in and work with the team that was there.
Now, in my work doing acts of journalism, I've run into war correspondents all along, and it takes something extra, something that I don't have within me to actually decide to go into a war zone. And this was your first one. But you've covered other pretty dangerous situations. What made you want to actually go cover this?
It's a really good question. Let me say, first of all, that, one of the things that was a real blessing for me, Rod, was that when I got to Ukraine, I was surrounded by incredibly talented professional NPR correspondents, many of them who, did have experience in war zones. And so I really was able to kind of ride their coattails a little bit and learn from them. And so I wasn't thrown into the sort of deep end with no support. But, I have to say, I really did see this invasion and the ideas about Russia and the role that Putin was playing in the world when I was there in Beijing. It really, it fascinated me and it troubled me. And I just decided that it was something that I wanted to help cover if NPR needed me and if there was, room on the team for me. And so, I felt really compelled to be part of this story. I do want to emphasize that while it is a very risky environment, and the team that's there now is, they're in in harm's way. The NPR reporters they're all remarkable people. NPR does do everything possible to keep its journalists and its Ukrainian teams as safe as possible. So, we are, it is hazardous. It is scary, really scary at times, but, they do everything that they can to keep us safe.
Well, that's very good to hear, but there's still a big jump between war correspondent, even then covering a hurricane or a disaster or the opioid crisis. Was there something other than the interest in the story and the way, and of course the sort of connection or the closeness that you had with the influence of Vladimir Putin while you were covering the Olympics in Beijing? Was there something that kind of pushed you over the edge, and how did you prepare to actually go into the war zone?
That's a good question. The way that I prepared was to do, a ton of research about the political environment. I talked to generals, I talked to soldiers, I talked to everyone who I could to understand how this conflict was shaping up, to really get to where I felt like I could contribute as a journalist. In terms of the inspiration to be there, I've always been drawn to big stories. I've always felt like I wanted to be as close to, a big breaking news event as I could be. I'm not really sure what tipped me to feel like I wanted to play a part in this conflict, but I did just feel like it was a story that I wanted to help tell. And I have to say that as much as it was at times a traumatic and ugly place to be, I do feel honored and blessed to have been there. The Ukrainian people are remarkable. And, we live, sometimes it feels like in dark times here in the US. It can be confusing and lots of, intense news happening all the time, mass shootings and other events, wars around the world. But being there with these courageous people who are fighting so incredibly hard for their freedom and holding out in the way that they've done for these 9 months, I can't say entirely what the impulse was that got me there, but I'm glad that I went. It was a powerful experience and an important one for me.
So from the reports that I've heard of yours and from what you just said, it sounds like you were mainly on the Ukrainian side of the front. Did you have an opportunity at all to go to the Russian side of the front, or was that presented to you, or how was that decision made?
So the Russian military and the Russian government has made it clear that they will target journalists, right? So in some conflicts in the past, it's been possible to sort of report on both sides safely. Not this time. This time, the Russians are, they're a very dangerous military, very disorganized and very hostile to reporters. And so I worked entirely on the Ukrainian side. The one thing that I did do was work in what's called the gray zone. And what that is, Rod, is that this is such a long military front, and it involves artillery and drone attacks and different things that occur over a long period of the geography. And so sometimes it's hard to know sort of where you're at. Where is the front line? How far away are the Russians? And so there were times when we were definitely in a part of the conflict zone where both Ukrainian and Russian military were active. But even in those places, we were always in the company of Ukrainian military. That was the only way that we could be there and be there safely.
So it was your first time in a war zone. What did you think your job was there as a war correspondent? How did you decide what it was that you actually covered?
It's a really good question. I had two goals. The first was to tell really human stories, right? I'm not a veteran war correspondent. And so what I felt like I could bring to this was, looking for real people having real human experiences. And so when I would find displaced families, when I would find young people who were confused by what was happening to them, I felt like I could really contribute to some of that, and I could really sit and listen and spend time with them. And, one young woman who, I'll think of the rest of my life, she was fleeing by herself, leaving Odessa, trying to get out to Poland. And, she was terrified of the war and of the death that was around her there, but she was also terrified because, there's a lot of human trafficking and a lot of danger and organized crime around people who are fleeing. And so she was incredibly vulnerable. And, that was one of the stories that I was able to tell. As time went on, the other piece that I really wanted to contribute was trying to understand what it felt like for Ukrainian soldiers near the front lines. And so I did quite a bit of work right up until the time that I was forced to leave Ukraine. I did quite a bit of time working with military units, working with Ukrainian soldiers, really trying to get a feel for their lives, going to the trenches where they lived and fought against Russian tanks, going to bunkers where they lived underground while cruise missiles were landing. And again, because I'm not a military expert, what I was able to do was try to tell those soldiers individual human stories. And again, I have to say it was a really powerful experience to be with those men and women and hear how they were surviving, and they really were eager to talk and eager to tell their stories.
Now, Brian, do you speak Ukrainian or Russian? Because from what I read in some of your background and when we talked a little bit ahead of time, it seems like most of your beat has been confined to the United States and a little bit of Canada.
Yeah, that's right. I do not speak Russian or Ukrainian. So what happens with NPR's teams is that when a correspondent like myself goes into a country like Ukraine, is you're assigned to work usually with locals, people who are going to be your translator, people who help you kind of understand the local culture. Often you'll have a driver and also a security person, kind of bodyguard who keeps you safe. And there I really want to sort of nod at the fact that Ukrainians working incredibly professionally. A lot of them are actually journalists. They're people who, their own journalistic careers have been disrupted by the war. And so they've come to work for American news organizations, really talented writers and producers. And I was lucky enough to work with some great, very brave Ukrainian translators who traveled with me, into some of these frontline war zone areas really bravely. They're wearing body armor, they're wearing helmets just like I am.
Now that you actually bring up the whole journalism piece and people who worked as journalists who worked with you in the translation area, what role did you think a journalist and journalism played during this conflict? Russia invaded Ukraine. It was unauthorized by the UN and such. And journalism is supposed to be there to be the rough draft, to give the rough draft of history. What role do you think you yourself as a journalist and other journalists around that were there were playing?
So one of the things that's really interesting and troubling about this conflict, Rod, is that, obviously there's the violence of the war. There's cruise missiles hitting daily, tanks battling, all of that. But there's a whole other layer to this, and it's the information war or the disinformation propaganda war. And Russia, if you think about their interference in US elections, their presence on social media, Russia has been really masterful at trying to mislead and misinform people about things. And they have really launched a huge barrage of disinformation around this war. And so one of the things that was really fascinating was to be a journalist there, essentially trying to set the record straight, trying to push through that noise and push through that set of lies, and really try to inform people in Ukraine, in Europe, but also back here in the United States, where Russia's very active in trying to sway public opinion. And one of the things that was really beautiful, and it was really a powerful experience, was to be in Ukraine and have the Ukrainian people really embracing the idea of journalism, the idea, and they understood we were going to tell an objective, factual story. We were not just doing Ukrainian propaganda. We weren't there, to just fluff up what they were doing. We were going to report whatever we saw, but they wanted that, and they, and I really came away feeling like in these moments of conflict, especially in this modern age where there is so much conspiracy theory and disinformation, kind of QAnon level stuff. And really, I have to say, it is heartbreaking, the lies that the Russian people have been told about Ukraine, about Nazis running the government and persecution of Russian-speaking people. I was all over the country, and I looked, for any evidence that any of that was true, and it just wasn't. And sadly, of course, Russia has shut down the ability of most of their people to get good sources of information. And so I really did come away feeling like I had seen just how powerful reporting, factual, ethical reporting can be at helping people understand the truth about something, even something as ugly and violent as a war.
This is NPR correspondent Brian Mann, and you're listening and watching right now to Inside Covering the War in Ukraine, a production of St. Louis Public Radio in conjunction with the American Homefront Project, sponsored by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I've worked on the air for a very long time. You've worked in broadcast media for a very long time as well. We talked about it just before the chat. One of the big restriction that we have in broadcast media is time. And there's only so much that you can tell. You can put some more on the web, but a lot of things end up on the cutting room floor. Do you have an idea of a story or a part of the story from some of the situations that you talked about already that you'd like to give a little bit more of a full telling? You already mentioned something about a woman that you saw early on who was trying to get out of Ukraine, and she was very vulnerable. Maybe you'd like to tell a little story from that, or maybe there's something else on your mind that you kind of like to expand, that people that are watching this event right now would not normally get to hear during drive time, during Morning Edition, or All Things Considered during one of your reports.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was really remarkable, Rod, about being there was to watch the way that normal Ukrainian people would pick up their lives, even in the immediate aftermath of this violence. So, you would be in Mykolaiv or Odessa, and, a cruise missile would hit. There would be an explosion in the city, and the air raid sirens would be going off. Sometimes you would be in a place literally where you could hear Russian tanks firing in the distance, kind of the thunder of Russian tanks. And you would find Ukrainian people still sweeping the sidewalks and baking Easter bread, or going into a worship service. You would find people. There were times when I would ask someone a couple of questions, and they would insist that I come in and have a bowl of borscht. And their hospitality. Again, this is in moments when I was afraid for my own safety. And, it would be elderly people who would be, walking down the street with buckets that they would be, going to get water because the Russians had knocked out the water system in their city. But they would stop, and they would offer kindness, and they would offer hospitality. I kind of alluded to this before, but there is something really remarkable about the capacity not just to persevere in the face of this kind of ugliness and this kind of danger, but to do it in a way that is still very human. I'm not going to say that it, obviously Ukrainians get weary and they get scared, and they're human, but it really was a lesson for me every day that I was there about how to sort of have courage and have generosity. So yes, every time I would do a story about someone, I felt like I could do an hour-long documentary about that one little old lady. One of the stories that I did from Mykolaiv on a day that we actually came under Russian rocket fire. Just before we came under this rocket fire and we were hearing incoming artillery all around us, we pulled up in our car, and there were two elderly women sitting on a bench together, just out in the open, sitting on a bench. And they had a jar between them. And these women were sharing fresh homemade pickles. One of them had made her own recipe of fresh homemade pickles, and she'd come out with her friend, and she said, "We're just going to sit." It was a beautiful spring day. It was gorgeous outside, and they, despite the war, they were going to sit there and they were going to share these pickles. And of course, they wanted us to sit and have pickles with them. So those moments really stay with me, and they're a big part of the joy part of what this this work was about.
Now, did you serve in the military in the United States yourself?
No, I can't say that I have had that honor. No, I did not. My family has never really had that tradition, and it just wasn't a track that I followed. I've always admired it, but it wasn't part of my path.
And I asked that because I'm curious now that you're back, and actually you're back for the second time stateside. Mm-hmm. You have war stories to trade with other journalists. Do you think your experience, or have you found that your experience of finding these moments of really just kind of normal eating pickles in the middle of a shelling, do you see that this is something that has continued through other correspondents who cover war more frequently or have done it more than one time? Or did you think Ukraine was a special case, or have you had a chance to speak to people who've been in that kind of situation more frequently?
One of the things that was, first of all, I will say that I do think there's a pretty bright line between what we as journalists experience and what soldiers, whether they're United States soldiers or Ukrainian soldiers, experience. They take on risks that are much greater, and their commitment to, the work they're doing is very different. And again, it's something that I respect enormously. I think that, one of the things that was really great was spending time with more experienced war correspondents, people who've really learned deeply how to stay safe, how to tell good factual stories, how not to get caught up in the sort of hype and the adrenaline, but to really keep their heads about them. There were people there, and I'll just mention an amazing journalist named Tim Mack, who has just produced a documentary about a war crimes investigation that he managed to do, investigating a Russian war crime in the war zone, which just took amazing discipline and courage. And I also want to mention a remarkable journalist named Joanna Kakissis, who NPR has just named to be the permanent Ukrainian correspondent. She'll be really our frontline person there for the duration of the war. And yeah, I learned so much from them. And I came away just really humbled by not only by their courage, but also just their generosity to kind of take me under their wing and to, show me the ropes and to help me stay safe. There was a real kind of family connection that I felt there. It was a really profound experience.
Now, this is partially a question from me and also partially a question from Alex, who put his or her question in the chat. So if you have other questions, and I see about 5 other questions there as well, I'm going to try to pepper them in. Alex asked, despite the training and protection that NPR arranged, was there ever a time that you really feared for your safety? Even and my part on that is, even in spite all of the tutelage that you got from more experienced war correspondents or not, did you ever fear for your safety? And I think you might answer a couple of other questions I have when you give this answer.
Yes, the short answer is I feared for my safety many times. And anyone in Ukraine right now, the entire country is being hit by Russian cruise missiles on essentially a daily basis. And there were times, I will tell you, among the most troubling experiences where sometimes you would be relaxing. You would just be outside your hotel, taking a break and kind of, decompressing. And all of a sudden a cruise missile would explode overhead, having been intercepted by Ukrainian anti-aircraft fire. And so, you're in a peaceful moment, you're feeling like you're pretty far from the front lines, and all of a sudden, it's, all hell breaks loose. And that's disconcerting. And I was at the front lines under Russian rocket fire. That was a terrifying experience. And then the final thing, I mentioned that I was forced to leave Ukraine, and that's because I was in a military convoy near the front lines, near Kherson in the south. And the military convoy that I was in came under surveillance by Russian drones. And the drivers of these military vehicles, the Ukrainians, feared that we were going to come under attack. And so they were driving evasively, really fast, trying to get out of this kind of remote area near the trench works where we were, and unfortunately, my driver lost control of the vehicle, and there was a quite violent crash. I was injured, broke my leg, had to be evacuated. Some of my team were injured. So the bottom line is that NPR, like most news organizations, works incredibly diligently to minimize the risk, to keep us safe, to check every box to make sure that they've thought about everything. But at the end of the day, you're going into a war zone, and there are variables you just can't anticipate. And so, yes, I did feel frightened. I did feel incredibly scared at times. There were moments that, were very ugly. And I won't sugarcoat that, but at the same time, I did feel throughout that it was a really mission-driven project to be there. I never felt that it was, careless to be there. I never felt like it was, that it was not an important thing to try to be there and tell that story. And so even when I was frightened by things, there was at least part of my brain that was saying, okay, let's just keep working. Let's try to get this story.
I have this question, and I think many people do, but specifically Ken does. What was the reaction of your family even before you decided to go into Ukraine? And what if they thought since? I'm adding that little part on top of Ken's question.
They don't like that I went. They don't like that I hope to go back. They have also, I will say that since I was injured in Ukraine, my family has stepped up enormously to care for me and to help support me. And, along with NPR, which is the network, has been incredibly supportive. A lot of friends and family have really helped me since this happened. And so, but my mom scolds me regularly for a lot of my life choices, not least my decision to go cover this war in Ukraine.
And how do you answer them? I mean, clearly they hear you on the radio and they see you continue to do that, but how do you answer them in the moment?
Well, first of all, I have worked in hostile environments for many years, hurricane zones, mass shootings, big disaster areas. And so part of it is just, I say this is kind of just part of what I do. And then partially I say that, I always think really hard about the mission of a project. If there's a risk, something like this story, do I think it really matters enough to take this risk? And am I a journalist who can really contribute something meaningful that makes it worth the personal risk? And I have to say that the people around me, my family, they always have respected that. If I come back to them and say, okay, I've heard your concerns, I know you don't want me to go, but at the end of the day, I feel like this is an important one to do. They've always had my back. And so, it's really wonderful. And it's not an easy thing that I ask people who love me to put up with. So I'm very grateful.
Did you ever feel like you were in a time warp back to maybe World War II level conflict, as if it wasn't really a modern 2020 conflict when civilians were being targeted and levels of brutality that we thought were in the past were actually going on, since we're talking about all of this and we don't want to beat around the bush because we're talking about a war that's going on?
Yeah. So I love this question. And there are two ways that I do. First of all, I've always loved history. I've always been a big, I've been a big history buff about World War I and World War II, other conflicts in Europe. And so there were times when it really did feel like I had gone through a time machine. I mean, I was at trenches that looked like they were out of World War I. Where soldiers were living down underground in very primitive environments, gutting out conditions that are just, they seem impossible. So yeah, and the second thing I will say that felt like a time warp. I'm 57, and so a lot of the wars in my life have been really morally ambiguous and morally difficult to understand. Should we be there? Should we be fighting this war, whether it's Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan? This war feels like a time warp in that my best reporting, my best factual understanding of it is that there is no gray zone here. And this is like World War II in the sense that you have Russia as an aggressor nation doing something that the entire Western world has condemned, the United Nations, religious organizations. I mean, this is a conflict where we could have peace tomorrow if Russia would simply pull its army back, and it would not threaten the Russian people. Ukraine is never going to invade Russia. There's just nothing there in terms of there being sort of both sides to this story. And so it felt morally like something that somebody might have seen in World War II when, it was the Allies against the Nazis and against Japan. It feels like this sort of has some of that clarity to it. And that felt unique to me.
Did other war correspondents, maybe that you've spoken with and worked with, who were more experienced at the time, express that same sort of feeling? Did they feel like it felt like a throwback, or maybe other conflicts that they'd covered throughout the world?
I think this did feel startlingly kind of black and white to people. It felt, I had this conversation just, over a beer many times where people would say, yeah, normally, if I'm reporting on, a conflict in Africa or the Middle East or Afghanistan or wherever, you have to be really careful to figure out, who's right, who's wrong. Is there a right and wrong? And in this situation, again, as skeptical journalists, you're always looking for, where is the gray zone here? Where is the counter narrative? And it was basically what we were all coming up with was, this is a war that Vladimir Putin started. Did he have some legitimate concerns? Sure, but they're the kinds of things that could have been adjudicated by international tribunals. They're the kinds of things that weren't posing some kind of imminent threat to his society. And so, and again, I remain open still to somebody coming forward with some kind of factual basis that says, here's a reason why what Russia is doing makes some kind of sense. But, what Russia is doing at this point, there are as many as 50,000 individual war crimes that have been documented already by the Russian military. And that's probably an undercount. And so when you look at the horror of what the Kremlin and Moscow are doing to Ukraine, a democracy, it's very hard not to say that there is a moral clarity to this. And again, that feels very old-fashioned in some ways.
What key issue do you think that's going on right now in Ukraine and during the times that you have been there that's not being discussed by the big media outlets? And that question comes from Leslie.
Thanks for your question, Leslie. I think one of the things that's really hard to report on and really challenging to get at, and this is why it's, I think, underreported, is what might change the war from Moscow's perspective. How could this affect Russian society and the Russian leadership in a way that there is some change of approach or some change in strategy? Right now, it's very difficult to be a journalist inside Russia. I think the people who I've spoken to about this are pretty in the dark about who could influence Vladimir Putin to make some different choices here. What international pressure could cause there to be a change. And so I think one of the stories that I would love to see more attention to is, and I get asked this all the time, is how will this end? How will all of what we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine lead to some kind of resolution? And I think the reason for that is simply that right now it's pretty opaque. It's difficult to get into Moscow and to ask hard questions. Journalists can be arrested there and incarcerated. and it's just not a safe place to work. A lot of news organizations have shut down their Moscow bureaus. And so I think that's one of the really big questions. What will sort of cause a shift in the direction of the decision of Russia to continue perpetrating this violence? I think there's some really good journalists who are probably working away at that right now. And so I hope to see more of that really good reporting soon.
And we also have a question from Susan. Susan's question is, how can all of the work that's been done by NPR in coverage like yours that Susan feels is very good, how can that be more broadly disseminated so that people in the United States don't lose interest in the conflict? Like we're saying, it's still going on and you don't even know how it's going to end.
It's a really good question. Obviously, when you're a journalist and you become really focused on a story, as I am with Ukraine, it does break your heart a little bit when the attention of the country begins to shift away. I understand it. It's natural. The midterm elections come, lots of other news events come, and people, frankly, we're all kind of overwhelmed right now by the news cycle. There's so much going on. I will say that I'm incredibly proud that NPR has just, again, assigned a permanent, really talented correspondent, Joanna Kakissis, to do this work in Ukraine. So her work will continue to be really powerful and human, and I think that will pull people in. Beyond that, it's a really tough challenge. It's hard to get people's attention. One other thing that I will just be very, sort of frank and vulnerable about is I think a lot of people are burned out on dark and depressing stories. I cover the opioid epidemic when I'm not doing this work, and I have to be very careful about not just overwhelming people with doom all the time. And so that is another thing. If I could say that one strategy that I love about NPR and our storytelling from Ukraine is that, yes, we tell the hard stories about the suffering and the war and the violence, but you will also hear joy. You will hear music. You will hear, and this is the truth of almost any place you go in the world. This is another thing that I took away from Ukraine, but I've taken it away from many disaster areas, many ugly things that I've reported on, is it's really easy to get lost in the darkness, to get to where you think that's all that it is. But that's not true. There is so much beauty in Ukraine. There is so much dance and art and creativity. And I don't want to sugarcoat the ugliness of it. That's there too. But and I think NPR is doing a good job. Some other media organizations are also doing a good job to use light as well as darkness to tell the story. And hopefully that will allow people to keep coming back, not just be overwhelmed by it or begin to tune it out. And again, I don't say that people are tuning out Ukraine in a bitter way. I understand it. It's hard to keep these things in our minds right now. So I think that kind of storytelling where there is at least some joy and some beauty along with the hard truths, that's one way I think we can keep this in front of people.
Now, even though NPR has appointed a permanent correspondent for Ukraine, you've mentioned already that you're looking to go back. What's drawing you back there to continue to tell the story or to pick up where you left off from the last time that you were forced to come back to the United States?
Yeah, so once I'm completely healthy again, I would like to go back. It'll obviously be up to NPR and whether it sort of fits their editorial needs at the time. But I'm very committed to this story. I really fell in love with the Ukrainian people and with this story. There's something happening there, Rod, that is there is a democracy there that's being tested in a really profound way. And I'm really interested in this. I'm interested in people who believe in democracy, who, are willing to make great sacrifices for it. I'm really drawn to continuing to tell this story, if there's a role for me to play there. So I would go back in a heartbeat and will if circumstances allow it.
Well, you left under circumstances that you got injured and you needed to get out of there. But Paul asked, was it difficult to leave Ukraine after establishing all the relationships that you did with your team, plus the civilians that you've reported on and that you were in contact with?
It heartbreaking. It was, and I have to say that whenever I see other journalists rotating out of Ukraine, which is a standard practice for mental health and for wellness, a lot of news organizations will regularly rotate their correspondents out. It's a really good practice, I think. And what you see is them constantly saying, "Oh, I'm ready for a break. I need to come home for a little while, see my family," all of those things, but also just a real heartache to leave Ukraine and leave the people there. And I certainly felt that. And I communicate all the time with people who I met there. I have one of the beauties of living in this modern age is that, the people are a quick message away, a Zoom call away, Facebook message away. And so I'm in touch with people there all the time and really love that. So yeah, I'm as connected as I can be.
Do you feel like you fully left, or do you still feel like you have one foot in Ukraine?
I think that's right. I think I do still have, a lot of my heart and mind are there a lot of the time. I'm working really hard on other projects. And one of the things that I do as a journalist, one of my strengths as a journalist is that I kind of fall in love with things that I'm covering, even if they're, difficult or challenging. And so I'm working back in my addiction stories, reporting and covering people who are really struggling with the fentanyl crisis, and trying to keep people alive during that, which is its own kind of conflict. And so while, yes, there's a big part of my radar and my heart that's still there in Ukraine, I sort of have this other passion that I'm into now. So yeah, sometimes I'm getting pulled in a lot of different directions.
And since you cover addiction for NPR and you've covered now, you're a war correspondent, is there a similarity in how you've approached both of those seemingly different issues?
Well, I will say, one of the things that happened last year is that in the United States, we lost about 107,000 people to fatal overdoses. That's in 1 year. And so there is a kind of similar loss, a sense of loss. Again, the violence in Ukraine, I don't want to in any way minimize what's happening there, but there is a profound loss also here at home in what's happened with the addiction crisis. And there's in many ways, I do tell these stories very similarly in that I go in and I look for really human people who I can connect with and I can spend time with. I try to slow down and listen to them and spend time with them. It's not always possible, but to the extent that I can, I really try to have a very human connection and then do this very beautiful thing that I get to do, which is try to bring their voices and their stories back to as many people as I can. And that's and many of the techniques that I use in Ukraine are also the same techniques I would use in a disaster area or in a homeless camp here in the United States or, other places. So being vulnerable, shutting up and listening, really being quiet and still and just letting people talk to you, letting them tell their stories, letting them feel what they're feeling and trying to relate to it as much as possible. Those are all things that I think work, whether you're in a war zone or covering some other kind of difficult thing.
And I think you may have already answered the question that Jan posed on chat. Jan asked, how did you numb yourself to the really awful sightings to keep pushing forward with the job? Tell me if I'm wrong, and you can answer that question as well from Jan. It seems like you go through, you listen, and you tell the people stories, whether you're covering the fentanyl crisis or you're in the streets of Kyiv.
Yeah. So here's a thing that I'll say is that I don't numb myself. I feel I really feel these experiences. And one of the things I'll say, just in the interest of kind of transparency and pulling back the curtain, since I've been home from the war, I've been in, counseling that is part of the process when you've been in a war zone and when you've had a traumatic incident. And so I'm working with a crisis counselor to process and talk about what I've experienced there. And a lot of the things that come up in the conversation are about Ukraine, but I also talk about trauma from covering the opioid epidemic, or, I've lost sources over the last year. I've had many sources die in Ukraine, but also here in the United States. And so I don't numb myself, but what I do, and I really believe in talking openly about this, is self-care and being transparent about the fact that I do experience sorrow and depression. And there are times when I'm overwhelmed by what I've seen. There are times when I'm, I have a really hard time processing it. And I have a great support network. I'm very careful to maintain that. And some of these things, Rod, I'll say, are, again, bits of advice that have come from more experienced war correspondents. They've said, do not try to do this by yourself. Do not try to be a tough guy. Go home and let it come at you and get help and get people to talk to. And so I don't numb myself. Instead, what I do is I accept the sorrow of it, the difficulty of it, but I do also work very actively to also keep seeing the joy of it and the beauty of it. And then ultimately, I hope this doesn't sound too preachy, but I do also try to keep in mind the mission. Like, I believe in journalism. I believe that telling these stories has a really profound meaning. And I hope that's true. And that's what I tell myself. And so that gives me that energizes me to keep doing it.
Now, Alex asked, are there ways that you can tell stories about this particular war while you're stateside? And if for some reason you're not going back to Ukraine, what is next for you in terms of reporting? I will say, and then I'm going to let you answer that question. I happen to be in 9/11, or when 9/11 hit the United States, I was in Tokyo during that time. And I know the way that the story is being told in the United States was not quite the way it was being told or even being viewed in the grand scheme of things abroad. So it can be difficult trying to report these things from afar, because you're going to have very different perspectives and very different real outcomes depending on where you are. So again, to address the question with Alex, have you tried to do any work on this particular story while you've been on the States? And if for some reason you can't go back, what are you going to report on?
Yeah, great question. I did bring home stories where I'd gathered tape and research that I produced after I got home. And I also do have kind of a list of stories that I would like to get back to that I could cover from here, things to do with military strategy and with intelligence gathering, things like this. I'm being a little bit vague intentionally here, but there are sort of big picture things about where the war might go that you don't necessarily have to be near the front lines to get that perspective. And so, again, a lot of this will depend on other projects, other assignments, and NPR's needs. Obviously, I'm one journalist in their very big and very talented team. And so it'll kind of depend on what their needs are, how long the war goes on. That's always a big question. Where will we be in 3 months, 6 months? But yes, if I'm not able to go back, or if NPR decides that it's not, in their interest to send me back, I will definitely be trying to find other, good stories that I can tell from here.
And with your brain, your brain and your connection now that you have for the first time outside of the United States and Canada and into Ukraine, Alex asked this question: are Ukrainians and others in Europe fearful of nuclear war? And what about the possibility that Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons? Was that something that was discussed actually on the ground, or is that more of thing that's been discussed by people on the outside between Washington and Moscow? Was that a real concern that people had right there on the ground?
Yes, it's a very real concern. It was something that got talked about a lot, and it's happening at a very high level diplomatic. The Biden administration has been communicating with Moscow and the Kremlin, trying to convince Putin not to have this on the table. But using tactical nuclear weapons is part of the Kremlin's overall battle strategy. It's part of their war doctrine, is what people describe it as. And so it's not like it's some science fiction-y idea that's off on the horizon. It's a part of their overall strategy plan that could, in theory, come into play. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating and scary and terrifying is increasingly it's difficult to see how the Russian army stops the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army is getting stronger. It's getting better weapons, better equipment. The Russian army is showing more and more signs of weakness. And so the pressure on Moscow to use non-conventional forms of weaponry could well grow. And so I've spoken with many experts who are really worried about this. And certainly journalists and others on the ground are really worried about this. I think the latest indications are that this is not something that is an immediate fear or concern. But as this war plays out, if Russia is pushed back, it's going to be there's going to be some nervous times, kind of trying to see what Putin will do. And nuclear weapons certainly are one of the things, again, that are in his arsenal.
Where do you see the conflict going in the next 3 to 6 months? This is based on a question from Karen, and one that I have as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Karen. It's really interesting. A lot of the military experts who I talk to really see the Russian army struggling in profound ways. One of the things that was really interesting for me, and not as a non-war correspondent, was that suddenly doing this work for NPR, I sort of had an opening to call up military generals, top military experts, and just talk to them. What do you see happening here? And one of the things that a lot of them are describing is they're seeing structural patterns in Russia's military that show profound weakness, a real difficulty to get their command and control back in place, to get morale back up, to get the right kinds of equipment to soldiers. And meanwhile, while the Ukrainians are very careful to reveal very little about their military, they're very secretive. The indications that we can see are, again, it does appear that Ukraine's military is getting stronger and stronger. And so it looks as if there is the possibility that through this winter, Ukraine could gain more ground. They could push Russia back. I think that there is the potential for more military fighting, during the winter. It's going to be fascinating to see. But again, over the medium term, right now, Ukraine appears to have the advantage on the battlefield, and they appear to really be eager to press that advantage as far as they can. The one weakness on the Ukrainian side, and we've seen Russia trying to leverage this, is in the civilian infrastructure, blowing up power plants, blowing up other things that allow average Ukrainians to live somewhat decent lives. And Russia is obviously trying to demoralize the Ukrainian people. And so far that has not been effective, but they're going to keep pushing that strategy.
So speaking of infrastructure, was there ever a time that you, during your 2 different stints that you were there, did you find yourself without water or without access to, quote unquote, basics of day-to-day life?
Yeah, no, I was there at a time, and I think this would be very different now. Again, now that Russia has really begun much more aggressively targeting infrastructure, I think being out in some of the places where I was before would have been a lot, would be a lot rougher. At the time that I was there, one of the things that was a little bit surreal at times was that, I would, for example, be based out of Odessa, which is this remarkably beautiful Eastern European city, just one of the most gorgeous cities on earth. And I would leave in the early morning. We would convoy out into the war zone, which was, some hours away, do our reporting in this dangerous area. But then by evening, we would be back in Odessa, where we would have a good meal, and we would have, we would be in a modern hotel room. And it was, so sometimes that was an odd juxtaposition of sort of normal modern life over here and a kind of World War I kind of war zone over here. Again, unfortunately, sadly, conditions there have deteriorated a lot. And so I think my colleagues who are still in country have a much rougher time of it.
And that since you were sidelined because of your injury and the attack on the vehicle or near the vehicle where you were, have you decided to cover anything more domestic or more community based in the area where you've been stuck? Like maybe not stuck, but the area where you live, like in the Adirondacks. Ken asked, after being in a war zone, is there any concern about being motivated to cover community journalism in places like the Adirondacks, or maybe some of the other things that you covered other than the opioid crisis? Because you already mentioned you're still into that.
That's a really good question. And I have gotten really creative since my mobility is limited right now. It's a little harder for me to travel. And so I am doing a lot of stories where, I'm sort of doing things in this area of upstate New York where I live, and working on some just kind of fun outdoor features about the, some little, kind of holiday season type things. As you mentioned, Rod, I'm doing opioid related stuff, addiction related stories, some political stories. So I'm definitely doing what I can to stay busy during this time when again, my ability to get out and do stuff out in the wider world is limited for just a little bit. So that's good. I live in a beautiful part of the world, so being a little bit stuck here is not the worst thing.
And how is your leg? I wondered that. Brian online wondered that, and I'm sure other people are wondering that as well.
My leg is doing really well. I've been getting really great medical care, and I'm supposed to be walking pretty normally in about another month. And 100% recovery is planned. And so, as you mentioned at the beginning, I love hiking and climbing and skiing, and my doctors tell me that all of those things are, going to happen. And so I just have to be patient, and that's not always my strength. But so I'm doing physical therapy. I'm doing really well and healing well.
And Brian, before we let you go, is there anything that you feel that I missed, given this extended time that you were able to talk about your time there as a war correspondent for NPR? Is there anything big that you'd like to pass along to not just the folks that are live with us right now, but people who might be watching this in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Rod. I will say one final thought. One of the things that is really important to me, having covered this war, and especially seeing the violence of it linked to the disinformation and the propaganda and the conspiracy theories. When I came home to the United States, one of the times that I came home, as I was arriving back here in New York, there was this terrible incident in Buffalo, New York, where a young man who had also been influenced by propaganda and conspiracy theories and online lies went into a grocery store and murdered a bunch of Black grocery shoppers. It was a racially motivated attack. And what I came away from that thinking is that the kind of disinformation that I saw motivating the Russians to attack Ukraine, to lay siege to this fledgling off-road democracy, I think that there are some parallels here at home where I think it's really important to be vigilant about the way that we talk to each other, the way that we confront disinformation, propaganda, conspiracy theories. and work really hard in our own democracy to be alert to the risks that those can bring. The violence that gets attached to hating your neighbor, the potential violence that gets attached to rhetoric escalating and escalating. I think those are things that I've come to be much more alert to. And so one of the things that I do as a journalist, whether I'm covering the war in Ukraine or covering politics or other things here, is I am more alert to this, to the idea that we have to try to talk to each other, to have a civil dialogue, to have fact-based reporting, to treat each other as humans. Because I think that what we see in Russia and Ukraine is how ugly things can become if we let those lies and those propaganda threads, run away with us. And the final plug that I'll make here, this goes back to the questions earlier about journalism. I know that journalism is a flawed thing. Reporters don't always get it right. We don't always, do exactly what our audiences hope that we will live up to, those standards and ideals. But journalism is still, even more than ever before, I think, a force for good in illuminating this conversation, in pushing back the conspiracy theories and the hokum, and helping us see each other as accurately as possible and have informed conversations. So I really did come home from Ukraine thinking that the lessons of the Ukrainian people standing up for democracy, respecting journalism, looking for facts, that's a model that I really hope that a lot of Americans will keep leaning into here, because I think all of those things are essential, and I think there is kind of a link there. I think that's, I came home admiring the Ukrainian people and hoping to, in some ways that we can emulate them and have the kind of courage and alertness that they've shown over the last 9 months.
NPR correspondent Brian Mann, thank you very much for your words, for your work, which I played during Morning Edition, and I'm sure that all the people watching have heard over the last 9 months. And I hope that you get what you would like, but I wish you well, and I would continue looking forward to the work that you've done for the NPR network.
Rod, thank you for having me. Thanks to St. Louis Public Radio for having me. It's really been an honor to be part of this, and thanks to everybody who tuned in. Really appreciate you joining us.
And you've been listening to Inside Covering the War in Ukraine. This has been a virtual event featuring NPR correspondent Brian Mann, and it's also been a production of St. Louis Public Radio in conjunction with the American Homefront Project, sponsored by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. St. Louis Public Radio is a service of the University of Missouri St. Louis. A very good evening to all of you. I'm Rod Milam. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.